Hello everyone, let's see if this is gonna work. Hello everyone. As you can see, we are joined by a poodle. Hello, we are joined by a poodle. Now, what else was I gonna say? Oh yes, I've got to make sure Twitch is working. Twitch, you are my occasional nemesis of so many different levels. Ooh. Yeah, let's get this working. Now, for those who don't know, tonight there will be a double stream on Twitch, because later on there will be Pirates of the Burning Sea after this. Because there's always Pirates of the Burning Sea on a Saturday night, and that's because Pirates of the Burning Sea is cool. And also because, despite me taking a nice long time to get any good at it, and enjoying myself doing it slowly, I do enjoy it. Woohoo! Yes, that's working. Twitch is working. Yay! They are all working. I need iron brew. Hello everyone, and welcome to If Force Z Survived. Now, in about half a second, I'm going to manage to turn on the chat. And that should help us all right, shouldn't it? The chat working. Hopefully the chat works. Yes, it's working. Yes, the combined chat is working. And I am getting mildly bullied by a poodle, but that's not unusual, let's be honest. Me getting mildly bullied by a poodle is the standard get-go for this scenario. It happens. He bullies me. What can I say? Mainly he's bullying me because he's heard you're all here, and so he knows what time it is. And I'm basically being mildly cruel in that I'm not giving in. Your mummy has decreed you're on a diet. What's worse is you are live on camera at this precise time, so in a nice way I wouldn't have any plausible deniability. And you and I both know we live our lives by plausible deniability. If we do not have plausible deniability, we do not do it. Now, here is the fun thing about this. This is going to be slightly different from the normal what-ifs. And why is it going to be slightly different? Well, because honestly there have been quite a few videos on this channel, quite a few, on Force Z. So if you want to find out what happened to Force Z at a time limit, there are actually full of videos of that. So, unlike the normal what-ifs, where I do the history up until the shameless book plug, and then I do the what-if history, I'm going to launch straight into the what-if. But to an extent, I'm also, how do I put this politely, kind of helped by this scenario. For those who know anything about Force Z and its demise, will know it loses itself out to an air attack by what we call long-range medium bombers. Realistically, if I was trying to analyze them in terms of what they can carry and what they are, and they're good aircraft. They are good aircraft, but they're flying at the extent of their range. No fighter escort. They have no defensive weaponry at all aboard, everything to maximise their range. And honestly, because of the way their fuel scenario is, you change things even a tad. You have the Royal Navy ships just slightly faster, change their minds slightly earlier, the bombers change their minds slightly later. They're not going to have the fuel to engage. You could even increase just separate them by about 50 more miles, and they wouldn't see each other. They are literally, there are so many things stacked against that engagement happening. Not necessarily the result of the engagement, because once you're in a situation where you're under so many aircraft, they're attacking you, and you've got only ships, and they are doing the way they're doing it, you have problems. But even then, it's kind of stacked against them getting the result they are. The fact is, it's such a pulling it out of a hat. It is an amazing feat. This is something which is not thought about enough. Okay? The attack on Force Z, when you presume it's a preordained, of course it would happen, aircraft versus battleship stating, you are denigrating the very efforts of the pilots and the air crew involved in that strike. The efforts they put in, the navigation, the feat of, well, just keeping the aircraft aloft for that long, that does it. Oh. Chandler, yeah. That I do love that there are people who literally hate watch all my alternate histories. It's a case of literally the title, everything tells you it's an alternate history. Why? Why do yourself that plain? Why do that to yourself? But in the history of this, what if 4C survives? And what is the most likely scenario for them surviving? Well, honestly, the one which changes the least amount of history is just they are 50 miles apart. We don't have to change pretty much anything else. We can say they're 50 miles further apart, that the Japanese aircraft take a more, let's say, more easterly course, hugging the more westerly course, hugging the coast more, looking for the ships, and the fleet moves out further to sea. So the Royal Navy's further into the South China Sea. The fleet is, the Japanese are more towards the land. And the thing is, that makes sense. Because honestly, the Japanese were hunting for a force which was out there hunting for an amphibious force. So realistically, they should have been hugging the coast. Because realistically, where do you hunt an amphibious force? The coastline. It's not like today when we talk about ranges of, well, we can put troops ashore from roughly 100 miles offshore. In those days, we can put troops ashore from roughly 200 yards, 2 miles offshore. It's not the helicopters, the massive range of landing craft and things we have today. It's a very different circumstance. So realistically, where the fleet should be is where the aircraft should be, and the fleet are only not there because they've given up and they're heading home. So realistically, they should be further out to sea, and the aircraft are still trying to hunt the ships, so they should be closer to shore. It all makes enough sense that that's realistically what should happen. And what does that do for us? What does 4C surviving do? Well, it changes quite a lot of history. Because the thing is, it's not going to happen the following day. There's not going to be a strike the following day. The aircraft aren't going to be in that position. They're going to be having to load up, rearm after this. By the way, number of aircraft which they get down to the field. The thing is, the Japanese actually lose more aircraft when they are landing back because they are so low on fuel than they lose to actually damage of enemy action. So that's probably going to be a problem for them. But also, if you consider subsequent days and very quickly, the force structure in the South China Sea is going to change dramatically. Drastic. I think I was sort of saying drastic. I was trying to invent a new word there, but dramatically. The force structure will change. And this is one of the things that you have to remember. Honestly, doing this maneuver, whilst, yes, it comes straight out of the Royal Navy's actions at Crete, Norway, Dunkirk, the whole way through the various operations to pull British troops out of all sorts of places in Europe and Europe and the Mediterranean. It's standard practice for the Royal Navy. If the army's in trouble, they go and try and do something about it. There is a limit to what they can do. The main thing that's going to be sorted out, the main differential that's going to be different in any subsequent days is, well, the command structure. And that really comes back to both this one and what we're talking about later on. But I would say the first thing that happens when 4C survives is you're going to have Admiral Tom Phillips walk into the Air Force commander and try and rip him and probably start ripping him a new one, because he's been told he had no air support when he was promised air support, and then he was told he had no air support. At which point the Air Force commander is probably going to explain, no, we meant you had no strike support. You still could have called on fighters. At which point Phillips is going to go, why the frigate would I need strike support from you? I have 2 capital ships with 10 14-inch guns and 6 15-inch guns. I needed air defense. That's what I was asking for. Oh, we presumed you thought strike support. Because you have to remember, the entire thing of their not having air support is because when the Royal Navy asks for air support, they're meaning fighter defense. When the RAF hears air support, they think you mean strike support. And they go, sorry, we don't have any aircraft available. So the Royal Navy goes off thinking they don't have fighters, which is why they don't call for fighters, because the RAF don't have any strike aircraft. Because they haven't agreed a common phraseology on this, because for some reason the whole months of working it out together in the Mediterranean have managed to not turn into a global structure of operations. It's managed to get back to the home fleet and RAF Home Command and Coastal Command, the structure, but it hasn't managed to get out to the Far East. That when the Royal Navy is asking for air support, they mean fighters, not strike. Now, there is a reason for that, probably, because the people out who the RAF work out of a lot in the Far East are the Army. And when the Army talk about air support, they mean close air support, aka strike. So this is a problem you have. The Navy, when they're asking for air support, mean one thing, the Army mean the other, and the RAF didn't understand the difference. So, in the nicest way, 4C surviving, when Phillips gets back, that's going to be sorted out very quickly. Probably with some shouting at first, and intemperate words, and then some organisation afterwards. Okay? So, the whole scenario of this would happen the next day, not going to happen. There could still be problems where aircraft could attack. Please, I'm not saying this is going to be a panacea. No panacea going on here. But it means that suddenly, if you were launching those aircraft at their longest range again, and they turned up, the fleet would probably have fighters overhead quite quickly. And let's be honest, even Buffaloes against unarmed Bettys would be a massacre. I think we can all agree that. An unarmed Betty wallowing with bombs is not exactly a threat to a fighter, which can just go, oh, we engaged you. You didn't fire back and we missed. Okay, coming around again. Hello, here I am again. It's just not a scenario for them. So, we now have this going on. Now, there are some issues going on, and we'll talk through those issues. This, I will admit, this does not go that far into the future. This really doesn't. This video goes as far as March 1942. Okay? Because, and I will explain why, it stops in March 1942. It is not a very long what if in terms of history. We are December 1941. I'm going to be talking you through roughly 4 months of history. So, with that being said, what happens next? Yes, Exit 9, Exit 8, war is always a race to the bottom. So, here is an interesting thing. Let's consider ABDA command and its formation. Around the table, you have Admirals Leighton, Helfrich, Hart, General Turborton, Colonel Kerrigan at head of the table, and Generals Wavell, Brett, and Brereton. Now, one of the reasons why there is a British Army officer, Wavell, put in charge, is because King and Roosevelt and pretty much every other senior person back in Washington is doing their level best to prevent MacArthur being put in charge. You'll also notice there are no Royal Navy admirals. There is a reason there are no Royal Navy admirals. They are all running around trying to reorganize the Navy after what had happened. So the thing is, ABDA command comes about and is slowly formed up over December and worked out and then has this conference in January. But it doesn't have Royal Navy officers, very a lot of Royal Navy senior officers involved in it. Because they aren't available. Because the big Royal Navy staff, which was supposed to be coordinating the war effort, goes down with Repulse and Prince of Wales. The senior officers, the leadership team, everything goes down. So this is another point which you've got to think. I would also say that when Phillips gets back to Singapore, he probably gets a nasty message from someone like Cunningham to remind him that he is now Commander-in-Chief of a station at war and he can't go off sailing on his own. It might be tempting. He might want the glory of action. He might think, well, Cape Matapan, all these things, I can do this. Don't tell your mother. He might think, you know, all these options. But no, realistically, he can't. And realistically, the first lesson is he's going to put a new headquarters. Which means he's probably going to set his headquarters up ashore in Singapore. Which means most likely ABDA Command ends up setting their headquarters up ashore in Singapore. And remember, this is not exactly unnormal for this time. You'd be talking about setting up in December, January, and Singapore looks fairly strong. No one expects Singapore to fall. Even at that point. And the point I would think you should remember is that most of the opinions of MacArthur at this period, and I know people don't, some people dislike the treatment of MacArthur, are based on his initial reaction when the Philippines attacked. The fact he shuts down. That's why a lot of very senior politicians and even army officers are campaigning to put a British officer in charge. Because if they send out anyone else, they have to supersede MacArthur. That would be embarrassing for the army, and they think he could get out of it. Because, as we've talked about before, MacArthur can actually deliver. This is the really bad thing. If MacArthur stopped writing checks of his ego and started writing them with his competence, he could actually be a decent general. It's just he writes the checks of his ego, not his ability. And that's his problem. But leaving that to one side, you'd have a Royal Navy officer in charge, and he'd be centred in Singapore. And it merely changes the structure of ABDA Command. It really does change its layout. Instead of having an officer who's back in India being an overall charge, and that's the thing, the guy who put in charge of it was the officer back in charge of India. The thing is, you also have a difference in terms of Malaysia, because one of the problems we've talked about with the British command structure in Malaysia is, well, and for all his problems, Arthur Percival is actually a very good officer. Okay? I would describe him as the British Army's C team, though, because whilst he's a very good planner and a very good staff officer, he differs over what decision to make. If his commander-in-chief of the area, the guy in supreme charge of ABDA command, is sitting on top of him in Singapore, then to an extent, Phillips, who, as we can see from his decision to go charging off to go and actually try and engage the amphibious forces to try and help the army out, is a fairly decisive commander. Percival has excellent plans, he just doesn't know which one to pick, because they're least worst options, and he keeps debating them. Whereas, to an extent, Philip sitting over his shoulder is going to go, pick one. But this one is this option, this one, I don't care. Pick one now and do it. And that can actually help Percival. Because it's one thing to... How do I put this? It's a very different thing being the commander of a force versus being the second in command of a force. You have all the power, you have all the role, but you don't have the same responsibility. This is the whole thing about the Year of Leadership, and why I thought this video was a great one to discuss with the Year of Leadership, because basically what we're doing is we're putting a staff, as well as a couple of capital ships, and a commander who is comfortable, thanks to his experience in the Admiralty Office of various other wings, with being absolute command. We don't know how good he's going to be, but we know he's comfortable with it, actually in the post. And we know there are good staff officers around him. They're just not good field commanders. Percival is a great staff officer. Percival, as the commander of the army, with someone above him to kick him occasionally to make a decision more quickly, could actually be doing a fairly good job. Because he had, as many people point out in the chat, literally written the textbook on how to defend Singapore and Malaya. He knew it better than anyone. That was one of his problems. He knew all the options and couldn't decide between them, and there's no one sitting above him close enough to give him the kick he needs to make the sodding decision. Excuse the French. General Shannon, Phillips, a destroyer man, being decisive, what a surprise. Yes, there is basically genetic coding. If you're a destroyer officer, you are going to be very decisive. No, again, Phillips is a destroyerman. He will ask the impossible from his number two and expect him to deliver it. But also, like Vian did on a fair number of occasions, and even, Lord bless him, Mount Bataan, when he was a destroyerman, no, the buck stops with me, they're my flotilla. You know, no, my deputy might have been, the deputy might have been in command of that unit when the problem happened, but the buck stops with me. When someone was being, a good example of this is when Sherbrooke was getting into issues in the flotilla a bit, and Vian basically went, no, Sherbrooke's mine. You always have to remember, that's the thing about the destroyermen when they come up from. They have a policy which I really do actually like, which is basically, no, they're mine. So it's my fault. If they do something wrong, I tell them off. You're allowed to praise my people. You're allowed to praise them, but only I'm allowed to tell them off. If there's something wrong, you tell me off. The buck stops with me. Mm-hmm. Hello, gorgeous. I know you think the more adoring you look on the camera, the more you're going to get, but you're not, because they are just as scared of your mother as I am. Mainly because she's my mother as well, and has reminded me almost every year that while she brought me into this world, she could also take me out of it if she needed to. So as much as I love you, no. They take after Admiral Duncan. Yeah, the destroyer faction of the Royal Navy in this period does come heavily from the same side of the same faction the Royal Navy as Admiral Duncan did. There is a faction of the Royal Navy which is all about personal responsibility and personal leadership, and almost about cult of personality. And they believe in a firm action to resolve things and firm leadership, but they also do believe the buck stops with them, not their subordinates. And so, yeah, Admiral Duncan, that's the faction which is dominant in the Royal Navy at this point. Hello. So, yeah. The other thing with ABDA command is that you do need a naval officer to bring it together, because it is going to be a naval command. Look at this, it's all liquid. ABDA command is liquid. It is about fleets and operations and what can your fleet sustain. And the other interesting thing is, if you have the Royal Navy taking on a more leadership, more affirmative role, then things change in other ways. One of the first things to think about is the reinforcements available. Hello, YouTube Minecraft watcher. Now, if we consider, in terms of force structure, and then we have what reinforcements could be coming, what could already be in the what's already in theatre. These destroyers, this is Force Z. This is what they can call upon. There's an interesting name here, isn't there? Think about it from the perspective of Betty's. And we rarely bring up, but it is an interesting option. There is Hermes sitting there. Let's be honest, Hermes flying sea gladiators could have dealt with those Betty bombers. That's the disturbing thing. When you're operating aircraft, when you're doing such a feat as the Japanese were doing with the bombers at that long range, when they have running low on fuel, have no defensive weapons loaded on to save weight, and are literally if you do have anything sitting there, it becomes enough of a problem. It's going to probably drive them off. So there you go, there's Hermes. Not the best, but better than... but, look, no, it's not the best, but it's something that's there. Do you have aircraft that can operate from it? That's the question. You also have Cornwall, Devonshire, Canberra, Exeter. Okay, there's a whole load of interesting cruisers. There's a whole load of 6-inch cruisers. There's Ceres, Colombo, Danae, Dauntless, Dragon, Durban, Emerald, Enterprise, Mauritius, Perth, Hobart, and Adelaide. There's a whole host of destroyers. The big weakness you are seeing in this force structure is those destroyers. From the Royal Navy side. Because they've lost so many in the Mediterranean and doing the things they've been doing and doing what they need to do around in North Atlantic, etc. They have a permanent shortage of destroyers at this current time. But there is a help there. There are all the American destroyers. Some of them are old ships, but they're still good destroyers. There's also Marblehead and Boise, and Houston. And then we've got some Dutch vessels, including the Cheven Provincian, which is a coastal bombardment ship. Monitor, sort of realistic, I think. Now, the interesting thing is this. And realistically, the interesting thing is this, is all these ships can be quite useful in different ways. All these ships can be quite useful in different ways. And all of them could be used more proactively than they were historically used. Because one of the troubles is, once the Royal Navy loses the capital ships, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, while they're getting reorganised, they pull everything back. They pull everything back to reorganise. They have to. And then Singapore falls, and they're forced back into the Indian Ocean. If you don't have Prince of Wales and Repulse lost, you get Hermes operating with them, and you have sorted out the Air Force scenario, then suddenly you're going to be slightly more aggressive. And the thing is, okay, these are only 2 capital ships. They're not the be-all and end-all. The Japanese have far more. But do you want to send cruisers up against that force? You see, historically, the Japanese cruisers go up against the Allied cruisers and they manage to knock 7 bells out of them at various long ranges thanks to torpedoes and other overwhelming numbers. But you've got a battleship in there, a fast battleship which has 10 14-inch guns, plus a old battle cruiser with 6 15-inch guns. They're going to muller any cruiser that comes near them. Let's be honest, there is not a single Japanese cruiser which wants to get in a gunfight with either of those two ships, under any circumstances. Yes, they will damage Repulse. But will they damage Repulse before she's flattened them? Well, considering how they're built, a single 15-inch shell will probably do the job. And this is not like the scenario Germany faces when they send out surface raiders. These ships could actually get back to a harbour where they could get repaired. And honestly, Emerald and Enterprise, well, they're pretty good for taking out enemy destroyers. The D-Class aren't bad cruisers. And then you've got Mauritius, Perth, Hobart and Adelaide, which are some fairly modern light cruisers. Not the best, but they're fairly modern. Okay, Cornwall, Devonshire, Canberra and Exeter. There's at least 3 full-fat counties in that group. Okay, one cut price county, but we'll leave that to one side. Exeter's crew is very brave. They're not up to the same gunnery standard the crew that fought at the Battle of River Plate were, but they're very brave, and they're out there to learn. You've got plenty of destroyers once you get the whole force together. What you need to do is build up a force. What you need to do is build up the force. And to an extent they were already doing this. There was an American flotilla already heading to Singapore. If you're forming up ABDA command, very quickly what you're going to do is start grouping at least the heavy cruisers, the light cruisers and as many of the destroyers you can grab together with those capital ships. Because you want to make a fighting force which can actually be a threat. In penny packets, they don't help. Penny packets look good to someone who's a general maybe, or someone like that. But everyone knows when you're talking about fleet command, you bring your assets together. Yes, oh goody, I have a dozen ships. They're all spread out in ways they can't support each other. There's no point in that. A naval fight is not a fight you can easily withdraw from. So you combine your ships together because then they can better defend themselves against air attack and sea attack. And let's be honest, Hermes is not going to be worth much, but as long as there's no actual enemy carrier in the region, and they don't get too close to enemy land bases, then she's going to be useful. And also, the other advantage you have for this force working together, and Walter Brodus is right to bring this up, is historically, ABDA command depends on a relatively junior, very nice, well-meaning Dutch officer for its fleet command, because he's the only senior officer who's commanding a fleet out there. He doesn't have a big staff. He can't readily communicate with the other fleets, because he doesn't have the right radio team, and he doesn't have the space for them aboard his ship. Does Prince of Wales lack A, for space, or B, not have a large staff aboard her? And C, Tom Phillips has probably had to move ashore into Singapore, which means the Prince of Wales is probably going to be acting as the task force centrepiece, but with a senior officer aboard to run it. This becomes your next issue, okay? Your next issue becomes senior officers. So what theoretically is available? Well, historically, what could be deployed by January 1942? I don't think the Japanese do more than December 1941 than they did historically. They have literally pooped the goose. They have thrown everything. They've got to rearm, restock, repair. Yes, you could, if you really wanted to, chuck things into an early operation, but that's not been their way at all. At no point in World War II do they, until it gets really close to the end for them, do they really start chucking things into operations out of just emergency, you've got to do something. They always try and plan it out and work out a plan for it first. So they're going to take some time. So, Indomitable historically joined Eastern Fleet in January 1942. The moment she turns up, you no longer have to rely on Hermes, and Hermes can go and become the cover for the R's. I'll explain why about that later. I would say, in this scenario, you'd also probably get Renown sent out. And there is a reason I think you get Renown sent out. You see, she's about the only vessel which is viable, which can be released from her duties and can go and be helpful and can get there quickly enough. And the reason you want to have her come out is that gives you an extra covering in terms of the Far East. I would say they'd probably like to deploy something like Warspite as well, but I think Renown's more likely. She was actually considered to be deployed, and is sensible to be deployed. She's got a speed advantage, and if you send her out, again, Phillips is probably going to be demanding, trying to ask for as well, if you send her out with Indomitable, you can get them both out there rather quickly, and the important thing about Renown coming out is she can come as she's fitted out to be a flagship. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Well, you see, the Royal Navy is going to need another senior officer out there. They're going to need another senior officer. And this is the point at which things start to get interesting. The Royal Navy do have senior officers who they deploy for various things. They do. They do have a Vice Admiral going around at this point who's their Vice Admiral on call. They're not going to send out Somerville. They're not going to send out Somerville. Prince of Wales is Phillips' flagship. And the thing is, if Phillips is going to sea, he's going to want her to be his flagship, which means you can't have your task force commander who's commanding your forces operate in the same ship. Somerville is another admiral. Somerville can't be sent out because he's not junior enough. And he's got his own command. The officer you probably send out on Renown to take command is a guy called Cifrit. Neville Cifrit. For those who aren't sure who he is, he's a Vice Admiral at this point who is, well, he commands Operation Ironclad, which he takes part, which is the invasion of Madagascar in 1942. He commands Operation Pedestal. He is the Royal Navy in this period of December to 1941 to about June 1942. He is the Royal Navy's Vice Admiral of choice every time they need a Vice Admiral for something. So my real suggestion here is, the moment Phillips realises he can't go to sea, he looks around, he's only got Rear Admirals. He can't promote one of them to a Vice Admiral. He needs a Vice Admiral out there as part of ABDA command. The Vice Admiral needs to have his own flagship. Repulse is not fitted up to be a modern flagship. Indomitable's coming out, but they've not got another person on this. And Dalrymple Hamilton is not senior enough. Dalrymple Hamilton is not... He's a Rear Admiral, Wayne. He's got to be a Vice Admiral. It's got to be a 3-star. So Cifrit is a safe pair of hands. And he's a Vice Admiral. He's a trusted officer. The USN Admiral in charge of the Asiatic Squadron is in the area. But again, you can't put a USN Admiral or a Royal Navy Admiral as the fleet of the fleet as the surface forces commander when you've only got an admiral in charge of the force. It causes too much trouble. They're both 4-stars. And the other problem for the Americans, as they were working out and dealing with ABDA command, was the fact that their officers were all considered brevet appointments. They weren't actually confirmed in post as full admirals. They were only acting in the post during their role. So, realistically, Cifrit comes out with Renown, probably catches up with Indomitable, and they both join the fleet at the same time. And Cifrit becomes the fleet-based support officer. The fleet-based commanding officer. So the guy who commands the ships, rather like he's already been doing for Cunningham, and he's done for other officers, he's going to be the at-sea officer in charge. He's going to be basically, we've got an admiral who's in charge of the overall area and operations, yes. But he has to command from shore because he has to coordinate everyone in 4 different commands and various air force and all the other things to get the things to work together. So yeah, we've sent out a vice admiral to command the fleet. And I don't think Hart will really object to that because I think Hart will understand. And as it was, it makes sense to an extent to have a vice admiral come out and take charge. And also, if the British are supplying, it's going to sound terrible, the free capital ships and the carrier, and no one else is stepping up and supplying that level of force, then the British get to pick who's the surface force commander. Because they're supplying the core of the surface force. Now, you do need those P-40s and various other things to be delivered, Walter, you do. And land-based air is still going to be an important thing. But again, if you have a carrier operating fighter defense, it's far easier for the carrier, while operating fighter defense, for the air defense net in Singapore to hear, carriers defending against air attack, coordinating fighters, we send fighters to support. Rather like, again, happens when fleets are operating in a facility of Malta and various other areas. You know, when the carriers are within range and land-based aircraft can go out to support, and they do. And they work with each other. They work with each other. So, do you need land-based air cover? It's one of those scenarios where I don't think anyone sensibly would ever turn it down. I don't think anyone sensibly would ever turn it down. But the thing is, it's a viability. So, you have Cifrit come out. Now, again, I would like you to all look up Neville Cifrit at some point, because he's someone who I'm going to be doing a video about at some point in the year of leadership. And he is cool. But the amount that is written about him is... oh, good lord, it's terrible. It's like... The guy goes on to become Naval Secretary... well, he won't be Naval Secretary. Vice Chief of Naval Staff, Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, and all sorts of other roles. And, yeah... he doesn't get much of a chat about him at all. He really doesn't. He's a good officer, though. A very good officer. S-Y-F-R-E-T. Neville Cifrit. And this is the kind of guy. This is the kind of guy which I often find funny because while doing this video, I did go and look at some other people's alternate histories just to see what people tend to go with, and almost no one goes and picks him. They're all picking these high-profile senior officers, and I'm going, you can't send them. There's a reason they weren't chosen for other operations, because you couldn't. They were needed what they were doing, and in some ways, it's better if Somerville isn't chosen. It gives them a chance to have a bit of a rest. The thing is, I don't expect the Japanese to be quietly doing nothing, but I do expect them to be thinking about things. But this is going to be very early January 1942, they're going to have those supplies in. So this leaves us with Admiral Sir Tom Phillips as Commander-in-Chief ABDA Command. Rear Admiral Arthur Palliser, probably still acting as his Chief of Staff and Deputy, but he's rather junior, having a Rear Admiral. Their plans had always been to send out a Vice Admiral to go with him and support him as well out there. So I'm not adding anything that is realistically not there. Now, with this as it's carried on, what else have we got? We've got quite a large force of ships. We've got quite a large force of vessels we can group around. We've got a fairly decent force structure. We have a fairly decent force structure. All in all, it looks quite good. But we still have a deteriorating situation in Malaya. Probably it's doing better than it was historically, but it's deteriorating. And we still have a deteriorating situation in terms of the overall war effort. But as of January 1942, we haven't lost anything significant. We haven't lost Singapore. We didn't historically. We haven't lost capital ship operation in the South China Sea, and the Japanese are probably working out how to deal with this. Now, historically, they do a few things. They do start playing around and start doing all sorts of interesting stuff. As soon as they have the forces ready, they start being active. So I expect them to do that here. I do expect that to be part of this scenario. But I also expect them to be, how do I put this politely, forced to deal with the situation as is, not as they wish it to be. Now, Shane's Booklog time. Time for me to say thank you to all for liking, sharing, and supporting the channel and helping it grow. Thank you for everything you've been doing. And you might have noticed that there is another video coming up with me and Drac discussing battleship development to support the trip to Japan. There are various targets at that point. We need to raise as much money as we can for that. For me, it was supposed to be not a problem this year. I was supposed to be able to self-finance it thanks to the joy of the house and everything else going through. And as you all know, that's still taking its sweet time. Hopefully it'll gone through soon, but so far I haven't even been able to buy my plane tickets, let alone anything else, because yeah, house sales. Who knew it'd be so difficult and so expensive? But the fact that I'm doing everything I'm doing is thanks to you. You might also have seen I was doing a bit of travelling this week. I got to see Dan, I got to see Drac. I went up basically to the old house and I closed it all up finally, because it's supposed to go through soon. And there are more books coming. The U-class book and the Flower class book will hopefully be are both written. The Flower class book, the pictures are in there. Everything's pretty much getting through. But I would say it's being happy with it, and I'm going to be working on it probably and tormenting my colleagues with it during our trip to Japan, which hopefully happens. How many parts will the Dreadnought be in the end? Well, here is the thing, and this is the point at which I say you really should watch part 2 this week, because if it's popular and if people like and people comment about it enough, there will be a third part which will be live. And this will be explained in better detail in the video, in which me and Drac will be building Dreadnoughts to various situations on Ultimate Adult Dreadnoughts. We'll be taking a criteria and we'll be building them live in front of you. So we'll see if we can get that to work. The idea, there are various discussions on how we get that to work and how we do that. Now, I'll also add that a lot of today's discussion, it has to be borne in mind that for the Japanese knocking out Prince of Wales and Repulse as quickly as they did in the war was an absolute fluke of luck they were very, very excited by and very happy with. It really did help. Okay. I'm sorry to say this, but as we're in this section, I can do this, so I can step out of it. Abuse of mainstream media can harm your mind. I think it has harmed your mind. Again, there are various people which do underestimate Japan. There are. But there are also quite a lot of people who don't. And one of the things, it's become one of those the things that comes through a lot in popular culture, is that the Japanese were able to do what they did because everyone had underestimated them. Not realistically. The problem for the British is that, to an extent, some people had underestimated them, but also the British have been planning for war against them for a long time and have been doing a lot of studies on them. So the Americans. It's just the forces they have available. That's the limitation. The forces they have available. Also, the Japanese do keep rolling sixes, which is, there are so many things they do which are just pure luck. And that shouldn't be taken away from them. Luck is a part of war. And if you're lucky, that's a good thing. For you. It's a bad thing, your opponent. But realistically, as we've been talking to also with this video, this topic, the fact that if they'd been 50 miles further apart, they wouldn't have seen each other. The fact is, if you'd had any fighter defence at all over the Prince of Wales and Repulse, the air bombers would have been massacred, and the elite anti-shipping shipping capability of their force of the Japanese long-range strike structure would have been decimated. There are just so many things here which should have gone wrong, but didn't. It's a really good thing for them. Yeah. And I would say also that to an extent, the underestimation of Japan has been used as a cover for some other decisions. I would say it's easy to go, oh, they underestimated Japan, rather than, well, they didn't implement zigzagging because they didn't see the point. It was difficult to do. It's easier to say we didn't do zigzagging because we underestimated our enemy than we didn't do zigzagging because we didn't have faith in our crews to actually do zigzagging without bashing into each other. That's an easier thing to say. And realistically, that's on them because they hadn't practiced zigzagging enough in peacetime. I think their officers could have done it. But I also think it was a scary point for various senior officers. If you consider the Royal Navy, when they started, they did more zigzagging practice than anyone in the interwar period and various other things. And even when they start out in war and during the war, they have accidents. The Royal Navy lose tribal class destroyers. HMS Punjabi gets split in half by, I think it's Punjabi. Yeah, it's Punjabi, which is split in half by a King George V because the zigzag goes wrong. War is inherently dangerous, and there are risks, and sometimes you make a judgment call as to which risk you go. And sometimes you get the right one, sometimes you get the wrong one. No, mainstream media, you obviously didn't hear me in talking about it. The missing fighter cover didn't come from that at all. The missing fighting cover came from misunderstanding, where the Royal Navy asked for air support. The RAF thought they meant strike capability. They said it wasn't available, but fighters didn't mention fighter support was. So the Royal Navy didn't think there was any fighter support available. It wasn't anything to do with the Japanese or any estimation on the Japanese. It was a colossal COCK up on the British side of internal communication. So that's not the case. And for your information, the British did do a lot of no air support operations against the Germans. If you have to, you go with no air support because you do the job you do. Crete and a fair number of operations took place without air support. You don't always have a carrier available. You do the job you have to do. You try and do it a different way. And they were trying to do it a different way. They were zigzagging, they were trying to operate as fast as they can, they were doing the options they could do. you know, life happens. So, let's consider the fall of Singapore, and could a fleet prevent this? Well, the interesting thing I want you to do is I want you to look at this map. And notice the route the Japanese army takes. Look at how they go down the west coast of Malaya. Now, there is a very interesting thing, because if you protect Malaya, you protect Sumatra. If you can stop the Japanese taking Singapore, you can stop them taking Sumatra. Dan Maxey, is that a doctrinal? No, they did recognise air support. Was not a problem. In the nicest way, it's a case of here. How do I put this politely? Okay, if you have a choice between not doing the mission or doing the mission, you do the mission and you go with the equipment you have, not what you always want. Navies, all armed forces are trained to go with what they have available, not what they necessarily want. So you never expect to be conducting an operation with all the equipment you desire. You're never going to. So the mission was, okay, let's risk it. Besides, the capital ships have got radar-guided gunnery, they've got enough air defences, all these things. But that's now well off the topic, but we'll get back to what we're doing. So, as saying, and you look at the defence of Singapore, and they're having to come down the coast. Okay, what can you do this? You don't want to use Prince of Wales and Repulse for those operations. But you have Royal Sovereign, Revenge, and if we consider the Chevron Provincial, don't we? We have 3 ships which are all perfect for shore bombardment. The central part of Malaya is a very interesting area to try and get through. You don't want to be doing that. So, if you consider the coastal regions, what you could find is a lot of those defensive positions, which are when they're being defended, and they're trying to hold them up and secure their positions, could suddenly find themselves with 15-inch gunfire as fire support. Now, the Japanese are very good. Do not get me wrong, the Japanese soldiers are very good soldiers, their officers are very well trained, they've got a lot of experience fighting in the Pacific, they've got a lot of experience fighting in jungle. They are very good at this. But you can't jump around the defensive line with amphibious landings if you've got battleships sitting there. You can try and dodge into the jungle, but you can't get your logistics working. And the battleships can be wandering up and down the coast, blasting away the logistics. And the thing is, your air bases and where you can support your aircraft are all back in Vietnam. Yes, the Japanese are trying to move them forward, but they haven't got them forward yet. And that's the other problem, because those air bases which you can take, which are best prepared to support your aircraft, are all going to be in range of these guns. So for the Japanese, this could really slow down their progress. And anything which slows down their progress and buys time for reinforcements to reach Singapore, for it to be properly organised, let's be honest, Singapore is an island. There is a natural part of the country which can be actually defended, of Malaya, which can be defended. If we look here, there is the Johor defence line peninsula. And that was actually put in place and was actually being worked on. Now, if that could have been delivered on, then the Japanese could well have been held up there. They could find themselves fighting a war in the Malay Peninsula, a long-term war. And realistically, what this means is because Force Z has survived, suddenly the Royal Navy's not going to be so skittish. And whilst you don't use Force Z, for doing this operation. You don't use the Eastern Fleet or the Surface Force for that. The Far Surface Force. The R-Class are perfectly fine for this. And in doing this, it helps you hold Sumatra as well. So if you can hold Sumatra and you can hold Singapore and you can hold this area, suddenly you've made things a lot easier for you. Now, ultimately, the Japanese are still quite good, I said, but again, what is often remembered is that forgotten is that when they take Singapore, they're out of artillery shells, they're out of food, they're out of water. They're running out of supplies. They bluff the British. The British have all three, but the British believe they are surrounded and have been beaten, and, well, Percival does, and so they surrender, and the Japanese get all those things suddenly from the British stockpiles in Singapore. Because their supply line is quite so tenuous, if you're managing to delay them, you're helping. Now there's another thing as well going on. If Singapore is not falling that quickly, if they're not doing that inexorable march down the peninsula, if they're being stopped and started, then suddenly those submarines which are sent to Western Australia, etc., will probably be rerouted to Singapore. So you probably get a lot of Allied force submarine structures operating out of Singapore, which leads us to the East Indies campaign. Okay? Here is the scenario. When you start looking at Dutch East Indies campaign, which is a major campaign for the Japanese forces, a major campaign, and you start looking at all the operations going on there, you've got a problem if you've got submarines operating out of Singapore. If you can use Singapore as your submarine base, if you can reinforce from there, because you have to remember, historically, Singapore falls between the 8th and the 15th of February 1942. If you are holding off the Japanese in January, if you are preventing them advancing down and they're not able to get in position to take Singapore, if they're not in a position to take the whole peninsula, then they're in a very different situation. And this operation, well, this operation becomes different as well, because, okay, yeah, you can probably do it. You can do some of these operations. You've got this amphibious capability. Think about the forces the Japanese send for this. They send cruisers. They send destroyers. They send merchant ships. They don't send capital ships. They don't send their carriers. They don't send them. But because there is no threat there which justifies sending them. Now you've got some fast capital ships, perhaps as many as 3. 3 fast capital ships. And a carrier. Think about that. Force Z is now at least 1 British carrier and 3 fast capital ships. I don't know about you, but that's going to worry me. If I'm the Japanese, that's going to be a force I'm going to have to think about how they take advantage of. Plus, there are submarines operating out of Singapore. Plus, there are the cruisers and the destroyers and that force as a whole operating together. That is suddenly a major threat. So I don't think I'm going to do the attacks on Sumatra. I think I'm probably going to do the attacks on Borneo, but I might actually go across... Well, I don't think I'm going to go into the South China Sea area, because that's probably more going to be a problem for me to go to Brunei, etc., and those things. I might go across the Celeb Sea. I might go across there. That's probably the sensible route for me. And the Molucca Sea as well. Sort of areas where I have some space. But am I going to get down into the Java Sea? No. I'm probably going to go after Dutch Borneo. I'm probably going to go after Celebes. I'm probably not going to go after Java. Or I'm going to wait till I have more forces there. I'm going to wait till I have a far larger fleet. And that's going to be about middle of February. When Nagumo and Kondo turn up. Well, they're the 25th of February to 9th of March, so the scenario they turn up. So, they are later in February, middle to late February, that we're finally going to get that fleet turning up. That's the scenario you have to start thinking of. That's when the Japanese start bringing the heavy forces down here historically, and that's when they can bring the heavy forces down here now. But that's going to be a very different scenario, because in this scenario, there is a carrier group. There are some fast capital ships. And that's if the British are on their own. That's if the British are on their own. Thailand CM, honestly, Chandlord, in this scenario, they are probably going to be in trouble working out what to do. If they've got the Japanese breathing down the necks, but also the Allies. They might try to go for neutral. They might chuck in a lot either way. It could go either way, honestly. It could go either way. The Japanese have a lot of political pull, so they might still pull into it, but they might not. Now, with this being said, what can we get here? Well, in February is the bombing of Darwin. And contrary to popular belief, people know that Japanese are mounting a fleet operation. It's just no one's got anything to organise to deal with it. That's the operation which we're talking about when Nagumo hit. So this is the scenario we're dealing with. Now, honestly, there will have been options and scenarios in this which we can talk about, but once you have the fighter defense, okay. Sorry, abuse of Minecraft Watcher, mainstream media. Okay, you keep coming with questions, and it's fine. It's too expensive in life, but it's a case of we've already explained this point earlier on and discussed this. So this is where it's sort of as I don't like leaving someone behind, but obviously you've missed about the first half hour, 45 minutes of the video. And so it's kind of, okay, so kind of I'm going to have to repeat it for you, to catch up, I'm going to repeat it, but I'm going to apologise to everyone else I'm repeating it for, okay? So, as I said, once you've sorted out the command structure, you've got Hermes, and in nicest way, with anything on board, the long-range Bettys aren't going to get in, because, as I said, they are long-ranged bombers, yes, but they are allowed to reach the ranges at which the capital ships are operating from. They are having to go out completely unfueled and completely unarmed. So honestly, they can be shot down by anything. That's the problem for them. The Japanese don't like doing it either. Now, with a larger force around them, and with Indomitable arriving in January, that's going to make it even more unlikely. And attacking them in harbour, if they are sitting in harbour waiting for them, yes, I suppose they could be. But again, the Japanese aren't that good at attacking things in harbour. They have trouble with the harbour in Pearl Harbor because of its depth. The harbour in Singapore is even more shallow and difficult for them to do it. So, yes, you would probably find at least, all these things will be operating out of Singapore. No, I don't want to ignore you because that'd be rude of me. But it's just a case of I feel like I'm I feel like I'm I don't want to upset other people by repeating myself. So I just. So it's not. There's nothing as you answer the question. It's just a case of I worry I'm going to be boring to anyone watching this video, going, "Oh, why is he repeating himself again?" It's just, it happens. Now, to be honest, no, Dan, the Royal Navy does actually have subs. One of the interesting things is the Royal Navy deployed quite a large flotilla of submarines to Perth during World War II, and work out at the Western Australia base. That's where most of the Royal Navy submarines in the area are operating from. So they deploy those to Singapore. So that's the thing. Okay? There's nothing wrong if you're doing that. I just sometimes worry with questions that I'm going to be I just worry sometimes that people are going to get the flow of the video is going to go and everything, because I'm having to keep coming back to go over ground which I already covered to answer the questions. That's what I sort of worry about. Now, hello, cutie. Now, where was I? I'll check my notes. So, no, there's even some of them out in the early conflict, Stan. Believe it or not. Not many, but there's some. Now, in this scenario, you probably have had some submarines rushed out there again. You have a scenario where you have Tom Phillips in charge. So you have a full admiral. So instead of the Royal Navy trying to scratch to organise themselves, you have someone shouting for support and shouting for assistance and shouting for need. And it's a different scenario that's gonna get into a different that we're gonna have. Now, the interesting thing is, Walter Brodus has just said what many did suspect at the time, that all this Allied cooperation is going to fall apart with everyone wanting to defend their own little turf. Yeah, that's what a lot of people thought at the time. Luckily, it didn't. Luckily, historically, we know they fought and died alongside each other. So the history is they all die alongside each other, trying to defend each other. So, you can make of that of you will. But that's why I've not included that as part of the scenario, because historically, they go down hard as they can, fighting alongside each other. That's ABDA command. A whole load of heroic small little fights, as they're off in penny packets, fighting mixed in amongst each other and dying. But in this scenario, they have a staff which can actually coordinate them. They have a staff where they have flagships and things to form themselves up around, and they will have done. And my strong suspicion is that when you get the notifications that the Japanese are sending a carrier force down into this area, that reinforcements start arriving. Historically, Illustrious gets out here quite quickly, and Formidable gets out quite quickly, etc. And various other vessels, carriers, get out here quite quickly. And that helps. I think the British would probably have, by this point, about 2 carriers out here. I think they would be full Eastern Fleet carriers. So it would be like you face in when Operation C. And realistically, Operation C is also, not too far from this period we're talking about. Because when we're talking about this, we're probably going to be getting a Battle of the Java Sea. That's what we're probably going to get. Not Admiral Dorman in charge, but we're going to get a Battle of the Java Sea. And the likelihood is it's going to be an ambush of the Japanese force. Or the Japanese going for it. Because I think the scenario I was looking at was, would the Japanese go straight to Singapore? They could do, but they'll be flying into a very concentrated air search net set up. They'll be flying into a war zone where everyone's already on active alert fighting anyway. And submarines and etc. will be operating from there. And I don't think they do that. I think they probably go down through the centre of the Dutch East Indies. I think, like they did historically to an extent, I think they go through the part of the, if you follow the line, you can see there's a line going down from the Japanese mandate straight to basically section C on the bottom of the graph, the bottom scale. And there's a line so going, that's roughly where I think the carrier group would go. I think they'd launch an attack, and they try and launch attacks to try and distract things, to try and pull things out to fight on their terms. Steve, no. Dorman wouldn't command. As I've said multiple times, he didn't have the staff, and there are capital ships to form up around, so whoever's in charge of them will be in charge. It'll be Vice Admiral Cifrit will be in charge of the ABDA's fleet surface forces. Not Dorman. That was the whole point of discussing Cifrit earlier. Okay. And the scenario is probably that if they can come down here, probably attack Darwin and go up and possibly attack Singapore as well. But that's a different scenario of attacking Singapore if it's still fighting. If it's fighting as heavily as that, yeah. Dorman will be part of the Dutch the fleet, but in a nice way. Dorman's commanding from a light cruiser. He hasn't got the staff. He's not going to be put in charge of a fleet of battleships and carriers. That's not the way it's going to work. And Dorman was also, well, not mistaken, yeah, he's a rear admiral. He's a Schubinacht. So he's a rear admiral. And don't want to be critiquing too much of Dorman, because I think he does, for the position he's put in, he does an okay job. But there's another reason why you send out a vice admiral. Now, with that all being said, when we've got all this scenario working out, you do know the Japanese, to an extent, are coming. You know they are coming. So the question is going to be, what do you do about it? If you've only got one carrier and 3 fast capital ships, you withdraw. Because that's not going to take on they're not going to take on the entire first air fleet. That's not going to take on that force. The Kido Butai is far too strong for it. But if you've got a couple of British carriers, and you could probably have at least a couple of British carriers, and if you can get a couple of American carriers and a force sent over, you could cause a lot of trouble. You see, if you think about the Java Sea and its scenario, if you can get fuel from Australia, and remember the British do have fueling facilities in Australia, if you can racetrack an American task force across the Pacific to Australia, fuel them up, and get them coming from this direction, and have a British task force from that direction, the Japanese going to the Java Sea, you could get them in the middle. You could do. There's all sorts of things you could do between between 2 allied task forces. And again, it wouldn't be unusual for a British Vice Admiral to be commanding a task force alongside some American ones. Now, with that being said, why is this the timeline? Why is this the timeline? Why do I have Operation C? All these things put in there. Because I think at a certain point, I think it would be closer to March, especially if you have a fleet operating down there. If you have a fleet based on a couple of carriers and some fast capital ships, the Japanese are going to know about it. They're going to know, and they're not going to come short. They're not going to come short. And that's going to be the issue. So I think you are going to wait to see the full force as was used for the Indian Ocean raid. I think you are going to wait till there's at least Akagi, Shikaku, Zukaku, Soryu, Hiryu, Hie, Krishina, Haruna, and Kongo all ready to go. Preferably a 6th carrier. I think you're going to see them, as historically was. The British had new Operation C was coming. They knew all this. They're doing this from signals traffic analysis, okay? Not even breaking code. It's signals traffic analysis. You know something's big coming. You know roughly where they seem to be looking for. And where the end of the stuff is going. I would say for the US... and for the considering the scenario we're talking about would be a chance for complete revenge on the Japanese carrier force. It's a potential. Callan, there was one, Hermes. We already talked about it, but also the Australian government hadn't professed any interest in aircraft carriers. The British government had tried a couple of times to get them interested in the idea in 1938, but yeah, and we've talked about this before. But I will say this, as is always, the general questions, please do keep them to the end. We'll do a general discussion. As always, we'll do a general question session at the end. And again, the Brock, as I've said before, the Kantai-Kessen is a decisive battle doctrine, yes, but it's supposed to come after a period of attrition and various other things, and it's supposed to take place closer to Japan, where they can bring even more force to bear. This would be a decisive battle, but not in the way they wanted it. Because I think one of the interesting things you've got to remember about Cifrit, and this is one of the reasons why it's interesting for him to be picked, is he's the commander, of course, in Operation Pedestal. He is the guy who runs a task force which has 4 Royal Navy aircraft carriers in it, and he likes night strikes. Like Somerville and others, he likes them. He likes aggressive actions. It would be an interesting scenario to have this going on, I think. I think also you would find that I'm not sure how the operation realistically goes. Okay, I'm going to be honest about that. But I will say this. I think one of the things you're going to get out there probably quite quickly is going to be some didos along with any carrier which comes out. Wherever a carrier goes, it tends to be not long after a dido, or pretty immediately a dido's there with it as escort. So I think you also have a dido, at least one deployed, possibly two or 3, if there's a couple of carriers there, with a couple of carriers that the British will have. I think you probably get a scenario where the Americans feel the need to reinforce the position out there, to put in more emphasis, especially if the British are providing quite as much force to it, because the Americans are going to feel like they're losing some of their position in the Pacific. You have to remember, historically, they're able to go, the Pacific is ours, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean are yours. In this scenario, you've suddenly got major capital ships, major forces operating, and they're supplying forces to it, but they're not in the central role they want to be. And then we have this scenario. Historically, the Americans don't do anything in this scenario because whatever they deploy is going into a zone where there's nothing there to support it. There's nothing there to assist it. They can't realistically do much. And that doesn't help them. For this scenario, there is a force there. There is something they can build up around. There is a structure they can work with. That's going to change things. Now again, it's not easy to get involved. You can't just click your fingers and go, yes, we'll get the range across there. But the Americans can get a carrier battle group, could get a couple of carriers and a task force, fast task force, across to Australia. They could do that. And from Australia, it can meet up with the British forces in operating out of Singapore. With enough warning, they can do that. Quickly, quietly, effectively. I think if you have a scenario whereby you manage to find a battle which has a couple of British and a couple of American carriers, plus all the allies together around them against a Japanese force, it's going to depend on who finds who first. And let me clarify that. If they're found first, if the Japanese are found and able to be hit at night, the British are going to dominate that. The British have the night striking capability. The Japanese, Lord love them, they have great optical range finders even for low light and in sort of night engagements and all these things, but they don't have radar and they don't have night fighting patrols at this point. So, in simple terms, you're going to realize you're under attack when things start getting very close and you can hear them. Without radar to provide early warning, you're depending on spotting things, and the British will be using surface search radar to guide themselves in which case you'll probably detect it. But to be fair, even if the Japanese are detecting surface search radar, and there's a debate as to whether they have the systems deployed in their ships at this point, they certainly get it later. They don't have it at this point, though, it seems. They're going to be being monitored the whole time. They're going to know the British are monitoring them. That's not going to tell them anything new. There's an aircraft spotting us. We know it's up there. It's not close enough for us to engage or even realistically guide something into it. And so, if the British hit them at night first, that's going to do enough damage, and the Americans are going to follow up at dawn, and that's probably going to be an annihilation. Because the American carrier strike, the Alpha Strike, is all about hitting. And so if you hit them it changes things dramatically. Realistically, if it happens during the daytime, if the Japanese spot the British and Americans first as a task force, then the Japanese have a preponderance of power which is going to be disturbing. British and American fighter doctrine, it's going to work out okay. British fighter control is tighter and will probably take the lead, whether the Americans want it or not. It'll probably happen mid-battle and be quite abrupt, but it'll probably be more likely the American squadron commanders in the air suddenly messaging the British ships going, give us orders, tell us where the enemy are, because our own team has like one person and a bag of string trying to sort us out, whereas you seem to have a team of about 5 or 6 people coordinating your fighters in the air. Can we please work with you? And then later on, after it's over, going, so, yeah, you know those ideas we've had for the last 5 years? Yes, we haven't implemented. You know the British have implemented something similar to those ideas? Yes. Right, we need to implement them right now, because that was a show. A ship show. But they'll lose carriers. And the British airstrike during the day is not worth the paper it's written on. Albacores are not worth the paper they're written on for a day strike against a formed up carrier force like the Japanese would possess. It's just not the case. That's going to be entirely on the American carriers if there's any day strike. But the thing is, again, it's heading into a region which is going to be quite well patrolled. It's one of those things this is one of those areas where there are a lot of spotters, a lot of people. There's one of the first things to set up is the coast watchers and the coast spotters. So for the Japanese, going through any of these routes is going to potentially, unless they manage to hug the center of them, the channels, and go through, pick their times going through, they're potentially going to get spotted by the coast watchers. And the various things that can be put there. I think, to be honest, the British capability of night strike is not something which people haven't realised by this point. The Americans are looking at going, we'd like to work up to it, but we don't have the time. We're working up our fleet to full strength at this moment, and that takes a whole lot of tech investment and a whole lot of time investment, and we don't have that because that would delay the growth of our fleet at this moment. It's something we're going to do. And eventually they do introduce night aircraft carriers which are designated for night operations. The Japanese will go, oh, frigate. That's it. They'll go, oh, frigate. They'll be, in the nicest way, there's nothing much they can do about it. They're going to go, oh, we need to... They're either going to think they need to retrain their entire air arm, or they're going to just be sitting there going, we've lost our carriers. Because that's the very real possibility. It's the British targets at night. The British and Americans and the Japanese all have the same target list when it comes to air attack. Take out the carriers, then take out everything else. Because once you've taken out the carriers, you can take out everything else at leisure. That's their plan. So, in a night strike scenario, the British torpedo bombers are going to be aiming for the carriers. And that's not a good scenario for the Japanese. Interesting thing is, the American scouting squadrons are often quite well trained at night flying. And they're sort of the cornerstone of their night groups in terms of it. So you might actually get some of the American dive bombers, which are their scouting squadrons, actually taking part in a night strike operation. If they've combined up into a joint task force, not just two task forces cooperating, but have joined into a joint ABDA task force and the carriers all operating together. If they've managed to get that close and managed to get together, I wouldn't be surprised the Americans try and join in. Admittedly, the scout bombers, probably just the scout bombers, but still. That could be quite useful, and the British would probably go, well, that's fine, we'll turn on our lights and you can follow us. I would also say that whilst you're all very right about the albacore, and I will mention it, you're very right about the albacore, the swordfish might prove a problem for even the Zero. And I say this out of the goodest point of my heart, but please note, the thing is, the Swordfish can fly so slowly. Okay, we've been over this before. No other aircraft in World War II quite has this party piece down so well. Fly so slowly that the aircraft fighters coming in can't fly slow enough to engage you, or they stall out. And so they then flit past and you shoot them from behind. I think a zero so might even suffer from that. But, you know. Now, the interesting thing is, coordination from forces which have never coordinated before is one of those things of, if you're trying to do something fancy, it won't work. It won't work. But there was a reason we were talking about the Atlantic Charter last week. You have to realise how long there have been Anglo-American naval discussions about cooperating together and plans of cooperation. It's been going on for years by this point. There have been a lot of discussions. And whilst the forces haven't coordinated together, they have got a lot of plans in place for how to coordinate together. Also, especially if it's just the scouting squadrons for the night strike, I will say this, especially if it's just the scouting squadrons for the night strike, they are very well trained professionals, and it will be a conversation probably between the scout leaders and the squadron leaders and the squadron commanders on the Royal Navy side. And they will probably work out something ad hoc between them. Will it be advanced? No. Will it be as simple as follow our lights and follow us there and follow us back? Probably yes. Might they find a way to jury-rig a beacon receiver into an American aircraft so it can receive the British beacon and track in on it in dark? Possibly. There are all sorts of options that they'll try. Yeah, abuse of mainstream media, it gets worse with the Swordfish when you read in some of the histories, because you start to realise that there are aircraft in the German forces which claim they were shot down by Spitfires, and you look up, the only Allied aircraft operating in that area was a Swordfish. Even HMS Warspite's Swordfish, it managed to dodge being strafed and fired its machine gun at an aircraft and didn't know what happened afterwards. There's an aircraft which was shot down in the area. The German pilot claims he was shot down by a Spitfire. There are no Spitfires in the area. The only Allied aircraft which claims to have shot at another aircraft was the Swordfish. Yeah, but we have to put that in the account of, we cannot confirm this because the German pilot claims he was shot down by a Spitfire. I'm not saying I'm not saying the Swordfish is good in that scenario. The Swordfish is still probably one of the finest torpedo bombers in the world in its era, in terms of its technological ability to drop its torpedo. But realistically, no. It's not what you should be using for a daytime strike. Nighttime? Honestly, I have no qualms about taking a Swordfish in the dark against a Japanese fleet. I would fly that. Because the Japanese fleet at night is not the threat to aircraft it is in the daytime. Especially at this point. I don't think any German pilot ever admitted he was shot down by a Swordfish. Anyway. With that being said... yes. All brothers are very correct. I would say also that... if putting all this together, I don't know, as I said, this battle could go either way. And I've done some very interesting simulations on my computer, which I do the simulations on, which uses a basis of... well, it used to work on an adaptation of Harpoon. It now works on an adaptation of this. So this is the base game, and the software I use works on adapt. Can you stop licking my chair, please? I know it's. I know you consider me wonderful, but licking my chair is example. But yeah. So basically, this is the base game. You can buy this. It's Command Modern Operations. It's interesting program which comes with, I kid you not, 4 different CDs in here, plus a massive book. Well, 4 different DVDs. It's fun, but I use software basically a software system which masks on top of that to run my simulations. Unfortunately, the software which I use on top of it is copyrighted, and the friend of mine who lets me use it, I'm not got permission to publish it or to sort of use pictures or you show it on screen, but that's what it uses as its basis. I use UAD for ship design stuff, and for some of the simulations when I'm trying to simulate small group ship tactics. When I'm doing whole fleet programs, and especially this one, I was running through simulations of what ships would get sent, how it would have worked out, etc. I use that, and well, I use the software on top of that because that can give me a whole overview of a full fleet scenario and a full force scenario. It's like the old Harpoon. Yes, it is. It is like the old Harpoon 2 on steroids. So you've been begging me for biscuits and you've got half a bowl of food left? Seriously? So, with that being said, question time. A6M2 might be able to do a low-speed pass. Yeah. I would. It might be. It might be. It might be able to do it, but I think it would have an interesting time with a Swordfish, because you have to remember the Swordfish's stall speed was... I'm just going to make sure I get this exactly right. The Fairy Swordfish's stall speed was 50 miles an hour. 54 if it was carrying a torpedo. When did Zoom Boom become accepted tactic? It was... It's basically, there are variations of it taking place in the full 1920s. There are ideas from it in World War I, but realistically, for operation by fleets, it's 1920s. We'll see what our hump carries and start thinking about it. Now, I would describe the Swordfish as, I think, very lucky X-Wing. Yeah. Hello. No, you can't keep blackmailing my... You cannot keep blackmailing my chat for biscuits. You can't. I know I've been away a week, but yeah. Questions open. And we'll see if we can get the bot to work, shall we? So just give me a second for to get the bot to work. Actually, I will do this until the bot's working. Oh. Done. Done. Raleigh, stop it for a second, please. to be fair, IKB 4472. A, my friend really doesn't care about money, and B, how do I put this? They've done a historical adaptation of the masking they've done on it as a kind thing for me to use. But I have rules about how I'm allowed to use that software. And one of them is that the computer involved is supposed to be air-gapped. So, yeah. And I do. It is air-gapped. Castanea, give it a second. The bot's still warming up. It's partially connected. Give it time. Oh, frig it. I'll just do the questions live, and we'll wait till the bot open. The bot will open up when the bot opens up. It's almost there. It's on 3 out of 4. 3. But yeah, I'll just start taking questions. So, Carnega, why has the Royal Navy and the Foreign Office not protested or done more to prevent scrap dealers from getting the warships in the Pacific? They're doing as much as they can do. In fact, honestly, that's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy now has OPVs based in in Singapore. Is they're assisting in those operations. And a lot of people haven't really realised that that's part of their reason for being out there, because it gives the Royal Navy a forward presence to do something about it. Because how do I put this politely? Keep demanding other people spend their budget to defend your history doesn't work that well. It doesn't always work that well. But, yeah. Actually turning up and doing it yourself can help out. Now, next question. Castanea. How likely is the surviving Force Z to draw off the Japanese air support from the attack on Wake Island? That's an interesting possibility. There is a chance. There is a chance that the Japanese, and I mean this in the nicest way, do draw off to attack this force and don't do Wake Island. But there's also a possibility they do Wake Island anyway. And the reason I say that is because you have to remember there is a bit of division. Wake Island is sort of the Navy's responsibility and Navy's aim. Southeast Asia is the Army's. And realistically, the Army might not want to call in the Navy. It won't assist, as sort of right, it's a case of the Japanese only have so much force available. And so they will deploy it where they can, when they can, and how they can. Thanks, Steve. But they will be forced to make more decisions. The survival of Force C, especially as it quickly grows. Again, Indomitable arrives. People forget how quickly in January 1942 Indomitable is there. Seriously, the amount of force which turns up in the Indian Ocean in January 1942, it's scary. That's the force the Royal Navy had on its way out there to assist. So, if it exists... Now, think about it. Wake Island... Well, that takes place in later December 1941. I don't think it's going to have much of an impact on the early stages, but on the later stages it might do. Because you have to remember, historically, Force Z is destroyed a lot earlier. So the thing is, The reinforcements which come out, the second wave, the second assault, the December the 23rd, the reinforcements, are those going to be able to come out? That's the question. Do they send out Soryu and Hiryu to take part in Wake Island, or do they send them down to try and deal with the force in the South China Sea? I think they probably still send them to the deal with Wake Island. I think that's where they'd still go. Because Wake Island is more of a priority to them at that point, and they think they can handle the British at any point. So I think that's been the case. And I've got Discord up, and you know. Oh, goodness gracious me, I missed it. We'll get there. Now, Broship's Q&A open. Right, thank you. So, Paul Amos, what effect would this timeline have on other theatres if all these ships are in the Far East? Does it leave the other places exposed? Yes and no. I think it might delay some operations. I would not be surprised if... Well, for starters, you don't need to do Madagascar. If the Japanese don't get Singapore, and if you're not as worried about that, and you haven't lost Force Z, then you might not feel the need to do the invasion of Madagascar, which is going to free up some resources. Or if you do the invasion, you're going to do it in different ways. Because you're not going to want to draw forces. Most of the forces we're talking about that are in the Eastern Fleet and are there in Operation Sea, etc., and these things, are also forces which are used in the invasion of Madagascar. Another reason why I went to Cifrit. He's the available Vice Admiral. He's the one who's going to be sent off for these operations. So, yeah, he's the Vice Admiral who'd be sent. You're going to be looking for another person to command Operation Pedestal at that point. But the thing is, that might mean you put Somerville in charge of Pedestal. So Pedestal could end up being run by Somerville because he won't be in the Eastern Fleet, and that can change that scenario. It's also going to mean you're going to have more carriers wandering around. What the Americans might end up having to do... there's a whole discussion over what carriers are going to be available for what operations. Honestly, again, it's all going to depend on how that battle goes. If the battle in February, March 1942 is an Allied victory, then that's going to change the force ratios dramatically. And the scenario in the Far East. It's going to stabilise things quite drastically. If it's an Allied loss, it's going to add 6 months onto the war. Maybe a bit longer. It's all going to depend on how the battle goes. You've got an advantage in that you're going to have a force which is, the vast majority of its force is full of people who have learnt they're in a war, so they either fight and do it properly, or they get killed, and have already gone through their... And this is what happens to every navy, by the way. They have about the first 6 months of war, 6 months to sometimes 12 months of war, actually, in some purpose phase, of where they're going, for them to realise they're actually in a war. Royal Navy's already been through that. So they'll have half the fleet will be from them, and half the fleet will probably be from America in that combined battle if it takes place. If the forces can't combine, then it's going to be a different scenario. How do the British play it? Because the British can't let the Japanese attack Australia without responding to it. They're going to have to, and I think the Japanese would have started to attack Australia as a way to draw the fleet out. So the British would probably, again, it would probably want to do it as a night strike. And again, if the British can deliver on the night strike, as I said with Operation Sea, if the night strike goes in and hits the Japanese, they're in trouble. because of the scenario they're faced with. It's not because the British are suddenly amazing, it's because they spent 20 years preparing to do a night strike and other people haven't. That's it. They put their resources into that area. The others put their resources into other things. And it's sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles. It turns out that thing that you've been funding for 20 years actually is an ace in the hole, rather than being a boondoggle. So it'll all work itself out at certain points over the times. Right then. Oh. That's annoying. That's annoying. Right, next question. Sorry, I was just told, why wasn't the bot working? And the bot isn't working because Elgato Stream Deck hasn't updated. These things get too complicated for my little old brain. Frank Bamwell, questions. If the USA decides to send the USS Arkansas around Africa, does that help? If I'm not mistaken, that doesn't help. BB-33 is a lovely ship, but she is a Wyoming-class battleship. Her top speed is 20.5 knots with a following wind. That's no help at all. No. No, Frank. She might join the R's. She probably would join the R's as a bombardment ship. Jones, how much difference would it make if Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Rod survived until Pearl Harbor strike? If they're still around, it makes a massive difference, because there's definitely a carrier with the... I swear, if Courageous and Glorious survive, as I've said before, the odds are there's at least one of them, if not two of them, with the fleet that launches the strike on Taranto. And I've done a whole video about that, 4 carriers strike on Taranto. And if you have that, then the Italian fleet's in a very different position. And then you have a very, very different force in the Eastern Fleet. And you have a very different carrier makeup, and you have lots of carriers probably out there, and lots of capital ships, and you have the Royal Navy having a fleet based probably on Ceylon, but maybe on Ceylon, because they probably reduce the presence in Mediterranean, but they need a force to be able to go into Mediterranean. This probably moved it earlier. Of about 3 or 4 carriers and 3 or 4 capital ships sitting in the Indian Ocean, ready to respond. And that changes things drastically, because if you have Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal, you have 3 more carriers. You have 3 more carriers available in service to go through. And they are decent-sized carriers. Are they the best carriers? No. In terms of Courageous and Glorious, they're not. But they are fine. They are perfectly functional, perfectly reasonable. We've done enough videos on Crete before, Walter Brodus, that frankly there are various options for Crete to be very different. There are lots of scenarios for Crete to be different. But this itself would not directly impact Crete. Although... yeah. There are a few naval operations going around which would affect. Would the Royal Navy send more subs to Singapore force and then add? Yes, probably would. But also you'd have the American... in the nicest way, again, if you think about Singapore and its area of operations, if you think about what the Americans achieved operating from Perth, which is down here, if you're operating from Singapore there, Suddenly the South China Sea, Philippine Islands, all these things. Think about the range of the American subs and the British subs and the Dutch subs operating out of Singapore. That's going to be annihilating. Hello, raiders. We have been raided. We've been raided. Hello, raiders. Yes, please. Bring on. Pop a shout out, but also, I'm. Hello, Sangloon. Thank you. Vanko, in their question, in this timeline, does the Philippines still fall, or do the US maintain control? Preferably MacArthur ends up disgraced and the Allies don't have to deal with him anymore. I don't think even a fleet there saves. I don't think you're going to get enough ships in there to save it. I think, nice way, the Philippines are still going to fall. As said, I think probably Borneo still falls. Honestly, the Japanese have too much momentum with them. This fleet can stop Sumatra, it can stop Java falling. I don't think it can stop Borneo falling, Borneo falling in some ways, and I don't think Celebs. I think both of them still fall. It's just very difficult to see them not falling. Because of the scenario they have. Because of the amount of forces. But the thing is, the Japanese control them is going to be tenuous at best, especially with the submarines getting involved and other things getting involved. To be honest, tenuous is putting in nicely. It's going to be a nightmare. They are probably going to spend a lot of their time dealing with very problematic supply chains. They are never going to get the fuel out of the Dutch East Indies they wished for. They are never going to get anything they realistically want. So, yeah. They're just going to be dealing with a constant problem. And the thing is, if you stabilize Singapore enough that you've got control of Singapore, and you're able to set up air bases in Sumatra, in Java, you can, along with Australia, you can probably keep Timor as well. Papua New Guinea. If you can keep these areas, maybe not Papua New Guinea, but it's certainly going to be interesting to see. But if you can keep this southern line of islands, so you can keep them that much further away from Australia, it's going to make life a lot easier in terms of defense and security, of force structure, and how you do it and how you approach it. MacArthur probably still remains in charge of the US forces out there, in terms of the US ground forces. He might not. He might cause a huge stink. But if ABDA command is working, they're not going to start replacing the British Admiral. And so that's probably going to lead to a scenario where the Americans are looking for a ground forces commander and want to provide the overall ground forces commander. And again, maybe you do, and maybe MacArthur gets it. Maybe he doesn't. It's going to depend how he works with Phillips. It's going to depend on how it works out. It could end up being that Phillips is quite happy to let him take the publicity, because it serves his scenario. Paul Amos, Jonathan Moon. Question: what port were you at when you logged off last week? So we know where to meet. What port was I at when I logged off last week? So we know where to meet. Ooh. I've been for a few ports in the last week. The one I spent the most time in was actually is a place called Exmouth, which is literally at the mouth of the River Ex. And last week it's a little port. It's nice. But yeah, it was fun. That was where I ended up getting the. I was in a lovely hotel, and as I said, I ended up being put up in a room which was not the one I paid for, but because they'd overbooked, that's the one I was put into, and I was promoted up, and it was a very nice room. It had a lovely view of the sea, and I was very thankful for it, and I enjoyed myself tremendously. They had an indoor pool, an outdoor pool. Hot tub, and it was a very nice walk down to the beach and down to the harbour to see everything. And I highly recommend it if you're in. You can soon work out this Devoncourt Hotel, I think it's called, in Exmouth. If you're ever in that area and you're looking for a hotel, I highly recommend it. It was really, really nice. It's not the hotel I normally stay at in the area. I must admit, there is another one I normally stay at because I have a little hidey hole, which is my standard stopping place, which I like to stop in when I'm driving up and down the country. It's a nice distance from home in Cornwall to stop at before I start there, so I can do the drive over the moors the next day. Mainly because I don't like to drive down the A30, etc. The fast roads, the A33 or A30 into Cornwall. I like to drive across the moors. I know, we're all supposed to want to drive. I do enjoy driving on the fast motorways. I'm not worried about that one, but it's a case of I like to drive across the moors. I have, of course, would never do any filming while driving. Never do that. But some footage may have magically appeared on my phone from when I was, from roughly when perhaps my car was paused, watching a BMW try and negotiate a traffic jam which was caused by some cows. I find driving over the moors, especially during tourist season, incredibly funny. Because all the horses are running around, the sheep around, the various herds of cows, and you see these people driving on going, I'm going to have a fun drive over the moors. And then they go, or there's the guy on the motorbike who's going, yes, I'm driving through this untapped country, and that cow's bigger than me and it's blocking the road. And so they have to slow down. And I just find it hilarious, okay? I'm that sad a personality. I do admit it. And there's some interesting questions coming up I can see about C Team of UK leadership, UK land leadership. Castaneda, how much does the ability to stage supplies through Singapore help the force in Bataan? It's useful. It's certainly going to make a difference. How much of a difference it's going to make is going to make on when depend on when those supplies are actually arrive. And that's the other difficult thing. It's going to have an impact on how do we do these supply runs. What force are we using to supply them? This is another reason why I think you want fast capital ships out there, because I could see you loading up the decks of Repulse and Renown, one or the other, with them, and having them do a solo run. A high speed, 30 odd knots, cruise in, drop off supplies and get out. Drop off the supplies on boats and get out. I could see them doing all sorts of fun things. But it's going to be interesting to see how they do it. Now, what happens if Operation Matador had been a success? Well, that was the plan, and I think I'm going to clarify, am I referring to the right Operation Matador? That was the plan for Malaya Command to invade southern Thailand in order to stop a Japanese amphibious attack on Malaya. Now, the thing is, that was never implemented and never done. But it is an interesting scenario to try and prevent them from landing in Singapore and various other places by doing that. I would say if you'd done it and it had been a success, you're probably dealing with an interesting relationship with Thailand, but it's kind of like gonna be the scenario with Iceland and various other things. The Brits are prepared to accept it for winning the war. That's one of the things you always have to remember, is that the Brits will often weigh the risk of doing things by the risk of not doing it. But realistically, the Brits don't have the force to move into Sunderland. You would have needed at least an armoured division sitting there, plus at least another two fully worked up infantry divisions sitting there to realistically have a chance. That's the reality. Don't hit the cow or the deer, they'll take you out. And if you're in a motorbike, really don't hit the cow. Steve, yeah, QB 4472. Would it be possible for the US, for the IJN, that the IJN chased the RN Dutch too far into Java Sea, only find the USN and ran behind them? That is a scenario, but there's also the scenario that I think the Royal Australian Navy would probably be operating with the Royal Navy in this scenario. In this scenario, if you have such a large force out there, again, it's one of those interesting things. If the capital ships aren't lost and the carriers and forces form up, then the narrative of the British abandoning Australia probably doesn't get the hold it does post-war, because they're going to remember what these ships were doing. And I would argue, yes, before anyone asks you, there is a lot of too little too late going on in this scenario. The big too little too late was the fact that the capital ships were paused in 1939 by Churchill. Pausing carriers, capital ships and cruisers was really not the sensible idea. If they'd been completed on time and schedule, then the Royal Navy probably would have had some Lion class in service by this point, let alone these vessels, and would have had more carriers in service. Would probably be up to would have at least 4 more carriers possibly in service by this point than they did historically, even with the losses they sustained, and that would have made things very different. They'd possibly not have lost Ark Royal and other carriers as well, because with more carriers in service, they'd been able to take some carriers out of service to maintain them and refit them. And the problem for Ark Royal is part of the thing, she hadn't had a decent refit since war began. And she really needed a decent refit, and it goes through several other ships when we consider their losses. They're worked to death and they're in a weakened state before they're lost. Whereas if they'd been in a refitted state, they probably wouldn't have been lost. Or at least that damage shouldn't have sunk them. They might have been lost in a different way, but they shouldn't have been lost the way they were. So you have a lot of interesting scenarios going on here. I think if we go back to the question, though, I think you'd have the RAN, the Dutch, and the Royal Navy operating together. They'd be the force which would draw the Japanese in, and then the Americans would probably come behind. Maybe with some more RAN from them, but also maybe other vessels as well. It would be wherever their task forces could come from. I do see a scenario where you end up with with the British task force at one end of the Java Sea, the Americans at the other, and the Japanese in the middle. But there is part of me which wonders if that would also present a problem for the Allied planners, in that means the Americans haven't got there soon enough, that they haven't been able to combine, and realistically, again, they'd want to combine fleets. because even though it would be difficult to operate together, that would still give them the best chance of operating successfully, because everyone knows the larger the fleet you have operating together, the better, and the more chance you have for survival and success, because the more you can support each other. But yeah. Well, Ross, I understand the need to protect Singapore. Why does Hong Kong get the short straw? Because it's just undefensible. In fact, most of British war plans involve recapturing Singapore, involve recapturing Hong Kong. I mean, that's what it is. It's just too deep into enemy territory. It really is. It's just surrounded. It's a base for peacetime. In wartime, it's a base for recapturing and then using going forward. It's not the base which you're going to be able to maintain. It's just... realistically, one of the most stupid decisions ever made was to send the Canadians there. If there was any place which should have been quietly, and not so much abandoned, but quietly drawn down in terms of reinforcements, it's Hong Kong. Those reinforcements should all have been sent to Malaya. They should all have been, the Canadians should have been down sitting in Singapore. If you want to secure somewhere, send the Canadians down to Malaya, to Singapore, and tell them they're defending Singapore, and Malay command is commanding everything else, but they're coordinating Singapore. You'd be amazed at how big a difference that would make to the defense of Singapore if you have a brigade actually focus on that task. Damn, actually, you still have the C team of UK Ground Force leadership, yeah? Yes, but there is... you have to remember there is also Slim and various others coming up. So, the thing is, it's the C team with a lot more firepower, and they're good at planning, and they're good at staff work, and they've got someone decisive telling them to go get that off their butts and move. And you have got... if they're able to hold for long enough, then, again, if we go back to this... the scenario you've got to deal with is that the Japanese are going to have to deal with a threat coming from the other direction. And again, the more reinforcements you get, and also if it takes... okay, here is the other scenario which sees happening with ground forces, okay? And I take this idea from the various lessons which happened during World War II, but also happening... well, if you consider it amazing the Falklands War, there are scenarios going on now. If the ground forces commander is not doing his job, and the CNC in the area is sure he's not doing his job, he can find himself getting replaced. And there are various ways to replace him. You send in a divisional commander to take command of the divisions and start leading the land forces in that way. You can send in a corps commander beneath him. Or you can send in someone to replace him. You have options. If you think he is producing good plans, but is not providing the operational leadership you need for the force, you can find ways to move him so that he's providing the planning role as, let's say, land forces commander for ABDA command, whilst the operational commanders are at different levels, in which case Percival would actually be fairly good at that. Okay? Percival is good at the planning side of operations. He's good at the preparations. He understands these things very well. He's not good at making that decision because in some ways he lives too much in his head. So, realistically, you'll probably find someone will be put in place. But that's easier to do when there is someone there to act as a buffer should there be issues. So it's sort of a case of probably in about January, maybe early February 1942, there will be an officer turn up. He'll be probably B team, maybe low in the A team. He will be, when I say low in the A team, be been bumped up in command, but would have been, would normally be maybe a major general, but has now become a lieutenant general, probably, or something like that. who will be sent out there as, I would suggest, probably divisional commander of some kind, and put in charge, or corps commander. That is a very interesting operation. It could make a corps structure and go, all these formations are now part of this corps, and that will command and coordinate these things. There are options for how they do it. And then it'd be a case of, oh, good, well, now your job, sir, is to sort out my logistics. Yes, make sure I have the supplies. And give me plans and intelligence estimates. And my job is to do the fighting. And that can be organised. If you've got a CNC sitting in Singapore, and as said, Phillips probably very quickly is ordered to stay in Singapore and try and command and coordinate everything from Singapore. Alright. Falanco. If the night strike and the following day strike cripple remove the Japanese ability to launch aircraft, does an allied follow-up a strike end up racing the rounds and Prince of Wales to clean up what's left? Potentially. I'm fairly certain the American heavy cruisers and the British heavy cruisers and will be racing alongside the capital ships to see who gets there first. But realistically, if considering the damage an American day strike would do, dawn strike and the British night strike would do, that's probably the Japanese sans any carriers, possibly other things damaged as well. And even if you've got all 4 Congos, do you really want to take on the sheer amount of firepower which is coming your way? Maybe the Japanese do, but I doubt they're going to. I doubt they're going to want to take that on. I think they're going to try and withdraw. In which case, they're probably trying to withdraw through a pack of various nations' submarines going, oh! You came into our hunting ground! Singapore is one of those scenarios where you look at it and go, the Japanese are very, very lucky, and they pull off some very daring plans with luck, which shouldn't take it away from them, because it's you have to have the skill to make the luck work. Remember, luck is about 90% perspiration, 10% chance. Okay? You've done all the things in the first place which allow you to be in a position you can have the luck. This is what we mean when we talk about luck as a factor in war. It's 90% perspiration, 10% chance. Well, the Japanese have a lot of luck. But if they don't have that much luck, things get very interesting for them in the South China Sea very quickly. And Southeast Asia. And the thing is, they will take Borneo. I don't think they will hold it for long, and the same with Celebes. I think they get pushed back. I think they find themselves fighting a withdrawing battle from far earlier in this operation. Even if their carriers come down and they do win, there's now going to be a problem. Now, for the Japanese, again, the Mark 14 torpedo is a boon. But, as we talked about before, whilst it wouldn't be a perfect match, I am fairly certain between the Chief Petty Officers of the Royal Navy and the Royal US Navy, they could work out a way to get Royal Navy torpedoes working for US submarines, considering the space and facilities you have at Singapore. So, if they do end up having the Western forces, the Western submarines, instead of being based at Perth, are based at Singapore, I think some interesting things will happen. Will that be in time for this operation? Probably not. Later on, though, yes. Evergreen author. Could they have used Royal Navy torps if the Navy said working closely? Yeah, as said, I know I've chatted with Walter Brodus, especially I've chatted about this in the chat. It's not an easy tasking, but to get them to work together enough they can use them is different from getting them to work together perfectly. And I could see a scenario where the American boats would ideally like to go out with a couple of Royal Navy torps loaded, as if the Mark 14s are having a bad day, we've got something which, okay, may work, may not work, but if it works, it's going to go boom. Would I take out a full load of British torpedoes if I was an American submarine? No. Would I be tempted to take a couple out with me? Yeah, after they've been suitably adapted by the chiefs. Yeah, I would. Is it going to be easy? No. Is it going to be guaranteed? No. Am I going to have some more faith in it than I am going to have necessarily in my own Mark 14 torpedoes? Well, I turn around to the British and I see the British sub-commanders and see what they're doing with their torps, and that's probably going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to try and do things. You're probably going to have to adapt things like detonators rather than necessarily swap detonators, etc. And you have to remember, you also have to, in terms of things, work with the fire control systems on the submarines and the way they're configured. But these are all things which, again, naval personnel in this period, and even to this day, are fairly experienced at scrapyard wars. That scenario. As Mulder's right, it isn't a plug and play, but it also isn't a scenario where, let me put it this way, sufficiently motivated engineering inclined officers and NCOs with time and resources available of what in Singapore was a fairly well built up fleet facility with a lot of machine spaces and machine equipment. What can they achieve? British warheads on American torpedoes, it's slightly more difficult than that, but you can do some things. There are some options for how it could be sorted. The detonator is certainly a scenario, if it will fit and how you can make it fit. But again, I would say what you're dealing with is you will be dealing with the innovation of people who are worried about their own, who want to survive and want to do their jobs, and who, again, the frustration of the Bureau of Ordnance. And as said, if the Bureau of Ordnance have to protest, they have to get through Phillips. Yeah, that's the other problem as well for the Bureau of Ordnance in this scenario, because if it's Phillips sending back a complaint about their torpedoes, it's very difficult for them to shut up a Royal Navy Admiral. Because it'd be a case of, we disagree with your assessment. Excuse me, I'm a full Admiral of the Royal Navy and a 30-year destroyer and torpedo veteran. If I say your torpedoes aren't working, Sonny Jim, your torpedoes aren't working. So fix them. CC Admiral King. Admiral King going, there is a limey Admiral who is being more aggressive to my Bureau of Ordnance than me. This cannot come to be. No, more seriously would go, Bureau of Ordnance, you're coming for a meeting now. Don't bring biscuits or tea. You're not getting anything. No, I don't think King would walk down to the office. I think he'd have them come to him. There are lots of tests of corporations. I would say Korea's interesting test of operations, but as Walter Burris, you keep looking over the battles of Java Sea and various things where these navies fight and die alongside each other. They were, and the work they did in Australia, they did share bases, etc., and things in Australia, and they did all sorts of things in Australia with the limited facilities they had there. So, yeah, I think they'd work too well together. I think they would, because that's their starlings. And also, I would say this, the cooperation between the people in the field is always very different than the cooperation on a national level. Okay? On the national level, it's diplomacy, it's politics, it's all sorts of things. People in the field tend to go, so here, the enemy is the people shooting at us. Right? Right. And they're our ally, and they have something which works, and we have something which doesn't work. True. They have alcohol. Yes. We have ice cream. Yes. Do we have things that work that they don't have? Yes. They are really rather attracted to our power loading systems. And the spare parts we have for those therein, because they can adapt them onto their gun mounts to help them fire at higher angles. They like them. They like them. And we like their torpedo detonators. Yes, we like their torpedo detonators. Let's work this out. And again, we're talking about the first 6 months of the war when things are still being sorted out. It's not the period once you have the large amount of American infrastructure industry really churned up and starting churning stuff out. It's not that sort of scenario. We're not talking about mid-1942. We're not talking about end of 1942. We're talking about the beginning of 1942. I think there's a possible breeding ground for a lot of work together then. Now, NK33, have you heard of Laserpig? Yes. What do you think of his content? Well, as fellow historians, I like some stuff, I disagree with other stuff, and I have a standing policy that anything that gets into people interested in history is always a good thing. So that's it. But yeah, it's fun. Some of the stuff I look at and go, oh no. But some stuff I look at and go, oh cool. But there again, I do that when reading history books. I do that in all the time. This is the joy about being a historian. You stick 4 historians in a room, you will have 40 different opinions about anything. It's the way it goes. We love to argue. Sima, they can learn how to calibrate the US magazine detonators at the very least. There's all sorts of things the two groups can learn together. Falco, if Admiral Lee gets assigned to lead USN's fast battleships like he did historically, what else he gets to play with Renown and Prince of Wales, and how big is the grin if he does? Honestly, in a scenario like this, the odds are it is a combined force, and potentially you get more of the Royal Navy's fast battleships deployed out. Yeah. Because realistically, this is a perfect place for Royal Navy fast battleships to be. And the older, slower battleships get withdrawn to the North Atlantic. Well, the sailors from Tennessee, Kentucky make alcohol well. Yes, they do, but the sheer variety of alcohol you can get from the British is very different from them. And also, the thing is, the British have access to other things as well, which are going to make you very, very happy. In fact, honestly, the moment the Americans find out that Singapore has many bars with large amounts of alcohol supply and beer, probably the moment there's any American ships turn up there and start basing their force, you're probably going to get a US Marine division sent to reinforce them. Because the moment the US Navy goes, we've got a base here we're working from which has alcohol supply, judging from my work with US Marine Corps, will probably cause a Marine Corps division to magically appear in Singapore within days. Considering the US Marines' attachment to the bars on HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Queen Elizabeth. At which point Singapore is never falling. Because we all know the US Marines are very, very dogged in defence. Very dogged in defence. Yeah. Ewok, 40k. If Ukrainians manage to fire Storm Shadows from Su-24, I bet the Iron Torps can be used by US subs. It's one of those things of, if you've got enough time, enough energy, and you're prepared to put enough effort into it, you can make it work. You can make it work. And the thing is, again, you've got some... For the Japanese, this is a real problem, this force. And as I said, they might win the Battle of Java Sea. They might win. If they manage to find everyone first, and they manage to attack in the first thing at dawn, they could win. But as we know from the carrier battles, it's very rarely is a one-way street. If this is a battle like Coral Sea or Midway, where, well, like Coral Sea, where basically it's a on-paper victory, realistically a strategic draw, then that's a very different scenario. Lord Boris, actually no. The US Navy submariners start questioning it fairly quickly. Fairly quickly. It takes months for it to get up the chain of command, but it starts being questioned fairly quickly. And again, you're going to have very much operational personnel deployed there. Channel, would the lines be completed or are they stuck in development limbo? Stuck in development limbo still at this point. Still in development limbo at this point. Alpha Aurora, you might see more of a rush put onto Vanguard. Might see more of a rush put onto Vanguard. Alpha Aurora, will the new Battle of Java Sea end up seeing CVs shooting Java guns at night? Okay, I don't think it's likely, but I will say, in one of the scenarios it did happen. In one of the scenarios, one time. I ran it about 50 times on my software. And about one time it does actually happen. And I will, in honesty, I will say it ended up being the Battle of Java Sea about 40 out of the 50 times. And the other 10 times, it was split evenly, where it was a battle off the coast of Australia and it was a battle off the coast of Singapore. Believe it or not, the battles off the coast of Singapore and heading down the South China Sea was often the worst case for the Japanese, because they often run into a submarine line, and they often run into an air patrol line about mid in the South China Sea, so they get spotted coming, and there is a lot of capability available in Singapore to assist the Allied fleet. Even though in that scenario, usually the if they were coming there, the Americans at best got a single carrier to the force, so it was ended up being about 3 Allied carriers versus the Japanese 6. The scenario often didn't work out for the Japanese because they often got spotted and shadowed coming in from further away by the various patrol aircraft, and they would get attacked at night. You also have a scenario, you have a very different reporting scenario for submarines in, how to put this? Okay. The British have something called no ranks bars. And in Singapore, there are a lot of bars that are designated as, well, not so no ranks, which means your rank doesn't apply in them. Okay? Doesn't matter what your rank, anyone can go in them. Still, they sort of tend to group up into officer bars versus officer bars, NCO bars, and sailor bars because, well, let's be honest, they like a break from each other. But no, it's not a case of you go in there and you have to start saluting people. It's no bother one cares about ranking them. And that is often the best scenario the British have for, I know you want to go to bed and it's bedtime, but it's not, no one's yet come to get you, so no, you're not going to bed yet. That's often the reason why we often presume that the Royal Navy is somehow magically able to get information from its lower fleets up to its senior ranks more quickly. And we go, why are these people asking these questions all the time? The answer to that, as in my own research, has often come down to there are discussions in these bars. And information gets passed up informally. And then a senior officer starts looking for the information formally. And it might not even be that the senior officer is told directly. Because let's put it this way. Let's say you are... I'm going to get some iron brew. Have this. Going to get one of these. One of these 1901s. Should save this for tomorrow, but I'm going to have it now. Let's say you are a senior officer. And you've gone for a quiet drink at the end of the day, sorting out all the paperwork and trying to figure out these problems. And you are sitting having a quiet drink in the bar before you head to your hotel or residence, wherever you're staying. And you're sitting there quietly. And there's a table a couple of feet away from you. They don't realise you're there, no one's standing on ranks or anything, so it's all fine. And you hear them talking about their torpedoes not working and frustration about it. Now the question is, do you go and ask them questions about that now? Or do you wait till the next day when you walk into your office and you start asking questions then? Probably you do it the next day. Because they're drinking at this point. You're not going to get a decent response out of them that you could get problems caused. No point doing it. So, life happens. But that's often how the information goes up and down in the British structure. Quiet. No. No, Raleigh. You don't get to control the entire house according to the Ralsonian calendar. We've been over this. I know I've let you watch far too many episodes of The Big Bang Theory, but just because there is the Sheldonian calendar doesn't mean there's the Ralsonian calendar. And by the way, if you want a good timeline for this operation, there's this. Thinking of 4C. Gives you quite a lot of details. There's also a fairly good other things as well out there. What about turbots? Can Prince of Wales have another go at a Bismarck class? Probably unlikely. She's unlikely going to come back in time for another go at it. What about us? It's still going to get sorted out. Doesn't matter if Admiral Lockwood is the commander sub-specific or someone else's. It's still going to eventually reach the point at which they start having to make a decision about it and it starts going up. Yeah. And it's one of those interesting scenarios we got in history of if 4Z doesn't go down when they do. As I said, the first thing that happens is going to be Admiral Phillips meeting with the head of the RAF. And it's going to be a very short, sharp meeting. because he was absolutely annoyed by it, because he'd been promised air support. That's what he'd gone out under the thing of it, and then it'd been withdrawn as far as he was concerned. And the thing is that it hadn't been withdrawn. It was a failure of communication. But that's the problem. So, Phillips is going to try and sort that all out. As said again, if you then had in the fact that with those ships not lost, you'd be operating the Yars on the Malayan coast, and again, it's this map. It always comes down to this map. Those routes. There is one route which they could sort of go through the mountains. And that's the route which actually, believe it or not, the British forces withdraw down. So they could sort of go through that route. But again, if they're coming through the route, the reason why the Japanese don't do it is because they consider that route through the mountain too easy to be ambushed. Too easy to be stopped. No, that historically subs are almost as dangerous killers as summer. Yeah, Courageous, Ark Royal, Eagle, Yorktown, Wasp, Taiho, Shikaku, Shinano, yeah. And you're going to have a lot of subs operating in that area. And let's be honest, the Royal Navy have the T-class, which are designed as capital ship and carrier killers, firing a spread of 10 torpedoes to guarantee a kill. That's the literal discussion. When you look into the T-class, you go, so why are you firing 10 torpedoes forward? Well, we found out we need to guarantee at least 2 torpedoes hitting out of a spread to guarantee a sinking of a capital ship, or a disabling of it. Okay. Alright. So why 10? We calculate you have a 1 in 5 chance of hitting with a standard spread of torpedoes under most circumstances. So we fire 10 torpedoes. They then managed to increase it up and get it to a 1 in 3 chance of hitting with a torpedo. And then eventually they get it even up to a 1 in 2 chance of torpedo hitting with training and improving calculations. But the thing is, they build the T-boats based on that old 1 in 5. So there you go. They designed something which is supposed to kill a capital ship. Now, the reason was, historically, as I said, they didn't risk the R's or anything going into the coastal regions because they were worried about losing them with no air defense. And you also have no one to organize it. It's going to sound terrible, but the point is you need a staff officer in command. You need a fleet commander actually in command operating things, who is a fleet commander and able to be senior enough to everyone to actually coordinate them in the critical months of December and January. And that's the thing. The British don't really get sorted out in terms of the Royal Navy, in terms of fleet command, till probably February at best. March more likely. Because that's what happens when you have an entire command structure wiped out. In terms of 1942, available boats, You are... There's a fair... There's a... Ooh, let's see, probably about 9... 7, 15... 9, 7, 15... 22, 31... And they'd lost by that point... 2... 3, 4... 5... The Royal Navy has a fleet of roughly 20 T-boats that are operating in various theatres at this point. So yeah, they could probably get some out there. They'd probably be more American boats, but the British could probably get some of their boats out there as well. And they certainly did. But most of the British boats out there are the older ones, not T-boats, the older ones. What's happened? Gentlemen, I was referencing the British, Japanese ambushing the British retreat at Malaya. Because it wasn't a good position for the Japanese to ambush. The British retreating, the British were ahead. It was if the Japanese had followed them, the Japanese realised it was a good position for the British to ambush them, not for them to ambush the British, if that makes sense. So if you're following a retreating force and they set a position to ambush you, that's going to be bad for you. They couldn't. You can't ambush only if you can get ahead can you ambush a retreating force. I need to manage to do that. Stuart 40k. Yeah, imagine if Admiral Phillips survives sinking and then has a meeting with the RAF commander. Yeah, that would have been even worse. Yeah, the changes in the T-class torpedo layout was literally after they realised the various differences in the capability they could offer. In terms of letting the meet the same boats. Answer that one, Castner. Was there historically anyone in the theatre higher ranking than MacArthur at the end of February 1942? No. Not realistically. Probably Channel or Channel. Probably Crutchy still gets transferred to the RAN. So more than one per carrier in Kido Batai? Yes, I'm fairly certain they could have more than one per carrier in the Kido Batai, but the thing is there'd be a race between the American, the Dutch boats and the British boats about who gets the carriers. Right now. So it's almost been 3 hours. I'm going to finish up tonight, and then I'm going to go put someone to bed, because I don't think anyone else is coming to put him to bed, and then I'll be back and I will launch Pirates of the Burning Sea on Twitch. No, Slim is not a field marshal in 1942. In February 1942, NK33. Slim is not a Bill Slim is not a field marshal till he gets made field marshal. Let's see. That's quite late in World War II, isn't it? Why do I have so many notes on Muslim? He's not promoted till Field Marshal till 1953. And he's promoted to General in substantive rank in 1949. He was made an acting and lieutenant general in 1942, but that's the 8th of May. So no. In February 1942, there is no one who's senior to MacArthur. It's Wavell's in India, and he's put in charge of ABDA command, so there is someone senior to MacArthur. But the trouble is, Wavell's in India, and he really doesn't have much understanding of what's going on. That's a part of the problems. Because Wavell is India, and very much India. Now, what else have we got coming up? Well, next week we have... it's Hugo von Pohl, architect and proponent of World War II's World War I's unrestricted submarine warfare. Should be interesting for you all. Right. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it interesting. And as said, I will be back on Twitch very shortly for Pirates of the Burning Sea. And who knows what game I'll be playing tomorrow, because it honestly depends on Paradox. If they're working and it's connecting in, it will be Anno 1800. If it's not, it could be Timberborn or it could be Railgrade. It's going to depend on my mood at the time. And as always, brew ships will be tomorrow evening. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. Thank you. Thank you for the admins, all their work they've been doing. Thank you for all the great questions and chats. Yeah, just thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been a lot of fun. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. It's a bit nutty, but it always is. Thank you, take care, and I'm off to put a poodle to bed, because apparently we are half an hour late for the Ralsonian calendar. If you haven't noticed, he started being a bit whingy from about 10 o'clock onwards. Yes, the Ralsonian calendar, bed by 10. Everyone has to be woken up by 6, because they have to feed him his breakfast, but bed by 10. Take care, everyone. He needs his wool sleep.